January 6th, 1995. Two individuals walk into a bank in the greater Pittsburgh area and proceed to rob it without wearing any sort of mask. And several months later, after their faces were posted all over an episode of Crime Stoppers, they were caught within a few hours after being recognized by some locals. Upon arrest, one of the individuals shouted, "But I wore the lemon juice. I don't understand. I was wearing the lemon juice," referring to the fact that this individual had covered his face in lemon juice under the impression that this would make him unrecognizable on camera because he thought the lemon juice, acting as invisible ink when under heat, would somehow obscure security cameras from being able to detect his face. He stated that him and his accomplice had tested this theory by applying lemon juice and then taking a picture with a Polaroid camera where they seemed to have disappeared. Police have marked this up to either the film being ruined or them accidentally pointing the camera in the opposite direction. This has to be the single stupidest idea to rob a bank and get away with it that wasn't from an episode of Looney Tunes. In fact, when the story was later posted in an episode of the World Almanac, one professor at Cornell just couldn't get over how stupid this idea was. Anybody with a working brain would have known that putting lemon juice on your face wasn't going to make you unrecognizable to cameras, but then the professor thought more and considered, would it be possible that this guy was actually so stupid that he didn't even realize how stupid the idea was? That Cornell professor by the name of David Dunning then decided to pair up with his grad student Justin Kruger to put together a research study into seeing how well people feel in their confidence about subjects that they have varying degrees of knowledge. And they printed a paper that basically surmised that it is in fact possible to be so stupid that you think you're smart. This concept has been studied, tested, explained, and refuted in numerous ways over the course of the years, but the main sentiment is true. Most people who have a general understanding of a subject will overestimate how well they think they know the thing, generally maximizing with people who have the absolute most confidence with subjects they know the absolute least about. For instance, if you've ever watched somebody do a street interview where they try to guess the name of a Pokemon, almost all of them will rate their knowledge of Pokemon at like a 7 or an 8, except that's only a 7 or an 8 for the first 151 Pokemon. You show them anything from the last couple generations and it might as well be 0. And we call this effect the Dunning-Kruger. Any of you guys got a dad or an uncle that spends all day watching football to the point where he thinks he would be a better head coach than the actual head coach? Dunning-Kruger. Any of you guys got a friend or a brother that watches so much boxing or UFC that they think they could hold their own in a street fight? Dunning-Kruger. You ever met somebody who's watched 10 hours of YouTube explainers trying to introduce the concept of the Dunning-Kruger effect and you think you would do a good job at presenting it? I think I've done an okay job. This is a comic from the webcomic The Perry Bible Fellowship, a webcomic I used to read every single week before the years of YouTube, which is a scary time to think about. This particular one has actually been cemented in internet history. In fact, most of the comics have. They're all very good. But it portrays an example of Weeaboo, a word that ultimately means nothing, according to most on the internet, but we can extrapolate from this comic that clearly there is some sort of office game where the first person to say Weeaboo gets spanked and paddled by everybody else, but the idea that the word is ultimately nonsense is the idea here. In the early 2000s, people started to get sick of non-Japanese people becoming obsessed with Japanese culture, much like how nowadays that exact same thing is still happening. And people came up with a slur for these individuals that would be extrapolated from white Japanese or wannabe Japanese people, replacing the J with a W, making this word that I'm not going to say out loud. The reason I'm not going to say it out loud isn't because it's a derogatory term, more so because some consider it a slur. In fact, in the early 2000s, one 4chan moderator decided to replace all instances of this word with the word Weeaboo in order to limit people from using this slur. And if 4chan is gonna stop using a word, I'm not going to be the one to dig it back up. The word weeaboo is still ultimately nonsense. In fact, the reason he probably replaced it with weeaboo is because it started with the letter W, but ultimately he just picked a random word from a random webcomic. Little did he know he would alter the course of history. With 4chan users recognizing that the word was now replaced with the word weeaboo, they just started using the word weeaboo as the slur for people obsessed with Japanese culture, ultimately shortened to Weeb. Which is weird to think about just how random that sequence of events is to lead to the word weeb, because when you think of somebody who's obsessed with anime and doesn't live in Japan, like, I couldn't think of a better word. That's a weeb, you know what I mean? And it rolls off the tongue. But ultimately, the word that people use is the word that people use. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy, and it would be impossible for that one anonymous 4chan moderator to have known the repercussions of his actions. How could he? Dunning-Kruger. Behind me, you will find one of my favorite GIFs. Sharing GIFs is a mainstay on the modern internet. You've probably shared several of your own today even, if you have any friends left. A GIF is an acronym. 3 letters. It stands for Graphics Interchange Format. Graphics with a hard G, which is why it should be pronounced GIF. Some small-brained individuals on the internet will point to the fact that Stephen Wilhite, the lead computer scientist at CompuServe, the company that invented the GIF, pronounces it JIF with a soft G. And that may be true, but I don't think you understand just how true that is. Many people on the internet pronounce it JIF, and they'll say, you know, like the peanut butter company, JIF, and they'll think it's just some sort of coincidence when it isn't. Stephen Wilhite has actually stated that he named it JIF so that he would have the recognition of the already established peanut butter company JIF. In fact, many employees at CompuServe have been quoted as saying to themselves, "Choosy developers choose JIF," a literal parody of the already existing slogan for the peanut butter, which means JIF isn't pronounced JIF like the peanut butter company. JIF is pronounced JIF because of the peanut butter company. And I think it's incredible that an entire team of computer scientists that early in the internet could invent a format and still pronounce it wrong. That's a stupid pronunciation. How do you guys not know how to say the own thing that you invented? I know how. The Dunning-Kruger effect. I'm starting to think I'm not using that word correctly. Behind me, you will see a bunch of cherries and a bunch of peas. You can tell that because there's a lot of them and not a single one of them, because then it would be a cherry and a pea, correct? Not always. Back in the day, there was no singular form of either of these foods. The word cherries comes from cerise in French, but because it ends with an S, English speakers just assumed that if you took off the S, that must be what a singular form of a cherry or a pea must be, and enough people said it incorrectly that it eventually just became the right way to say a single cherry or a single pea. I would like to have a word with whoever is deplurifying words, because I would like to bring up the idea of the coccyx. 6? Last I checked, I only have 1. If I could go back in time and do anything, I would punch Shakespeare in his stupid mouth. Anybody who has ever done research into the etymology of words as I have will bump into 1,000 dead ends that all lead back to William Shakespeare. The dude had so much greed as to write 1,000 plays in an era where most people couldn't read that he's somehow been accredited with coming up with over 1,000 of today's modern used words as the first printed example of using these words. So naturally, when researching this video, I wanted to take a look at some of the words that William Shakespeare invented, and a lot of them I feel like are a little bit bullshit. Shakespeare is credited with coining the terms gossip and elbow, except not the invention of the term gossip or elbow as nouns, but rather gossip and elbow as verbs. As in, those words already existed, but he decided to just say, hey, what if I elbowed somebody? What if instead of spreading gossip, you gossiped? and therefore he's credited with inventing those words, I would argue that doesn't count. If there's one thing that I've learned from this nonsensical rabbit hole, it's that words have literally no meaning whatsoever unless we give it to them. Which means, if us the hyenas want to make up our own word that will go down in history as something that people continue to say, all we have to do is just keep saying it, and eventually it'll happen. Unfortunately, I didn't think that far ahead. With 400 something videos under my belt, if there was a single word that isn't in common vernacular that I had said in every single one of these videos, that could be the word that we could add to the dictionary. But unfortunately, I didn't have that foresight. Thanks for watching, I guess. Spisu.